Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. Chapter 1. The Dashwoods. The Dashwood family had long been in Sussex, at their residence at Norland Park. The real owner of the estate was Mr. Dashwood, an old single man who lived with his sister for many years. However, upon her death, the old Mr. Dashwood's life had considerably changed. He then invited his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, and his family to his house. The old gentleman lived comfortably with these relatives for a long time, until his death. Mr. Henry Dashwood had a son by his former marriage, and 3 daughters by his present wife, Mrs. Dashwood. The son, John Dashwood, was a respectable young man, who was provided with his mother's large fortune. Besides, he added to this wealth with the marriage of a rich lady. After the death of the old man, his will was read out. Very naturally, it caused disappointment and pleasure to some extent. Mr. Dashwood, in fact, expected a larger part of the estate to be left to his wife and daughters than his son. However, as it was beyond his power to change the situation, he had to be content. Mr. John Dashwood and his 4-year-old son Harry were left the greatest amount of the estate. As for the girls, the old man left only £1,000 apiece. When compared to Mr. John Dashwood's wealth, father of the girls had a very small amount, and Mrs. Dashwood was left nothing. With this severe disappointment and concern for the future of his 3 daughters and his wife, Mr. Dashwood did not manage to live long. He left £10,000 for his widow and daughters before his death. He called his son John and strongly recommended him to support his sisters and his mother-in-law. Although Mr. John Dashwood was not closely interested with his sisters and mother-in-law, he was touched by his father's will, and took it as his last wish. He was not a man of bad nature, in fact, but was cold-hearted and selfish sometimes. This attitude of his was backed up by his wife, who was rather self-centered and prejudiced. Yet just after his father's funeral, Mrs. John Dashwood arrived at Norland Park without informing Mrs. Dashwood in advance. This was her right, as the house was bequeathed to them. But the discourteousness of this conduct was found to be very unpleasing by Mrs. Dashwood, who despised her daughter-in-law for it. Being so deeply hurt, she even decided to leave the house following her arrival, but her elder daughter ELINOR, who carefully avoided any quarrel with her brother, persuaded her mother to stay. ELINOR, the eldest of the girls, possessed a strong understanding, capability, and judgment, which was truly based on fairness. She embodied a truly discreet and rather quiet form of good sense. Despite being only 19 years old, her mother always consulted her sensible mind. Besides her fairness, she had an excellent heart. Her affectionate countenance and her strong feelings were very sincere in nature, but she always knew to govern them. Marianne, in many aspects, resembled ELINOR. She was sensible and clever too, but her emotions, sorrows, and joys were never moderate. With a personality naturally eager in arts, music, books, and romance, she was warm-hearted, lively, and amiable. She was sometimes excessive in her emotional response to other people's ideas. In these aspects, she very much resembled her mother, especially for not being prudent and deliberate. ELINOR always observed the excess of her sister's sensibility with concern, although Mrs. Dashwood highly valued this part of her daughter's character. The youngest sister, Margaret, was a good-humored, friendly girl who sometimes caused improper behaviors due to her goodwill, making her sisters, especially ELINOR, uncomfortable. Anyway, only 13 years old, she undoubtedly had no ill intention on doing so. In addition, she was quite influenced by Marianne's romance. John Dashwood's wife, Mrs. John Dashwood, now settled herself as mistress of Norland Park, and her mother-in-law and sisters-in-law were automatically degraded to condition of visitors. However, she treated them with great civility. As for her husband, he really behaved affectionately towards them and urged them to consider Norland as their home. As Mrs. Dashwood had yet no plan to find a house in the neighborhood, John Dashwood's invitation was readily accepted. On the other hand, Mrs. John Dashwood did not approve of her husband's intention. Mr. John Dashwood had a plan to give them £3,000 from his own share. But as for his wife Fanny, she begged him to think it over. Could he rob his only child of such a large sum? Were not Miss Dashwoods related to him only by half-blood? What did they do to deserve this kind of a generosity? By giving away all his money to his half-sisters, he would ruin himself and their poor little son Harry. "It was my father's last request," he replied, "so I should help his widow and daughters." "But he was light-headed at that time," replied she. "He didn't know what he was talking about. Otherwise he certainly would not let you give away half of your fortune from your own child." "He did not articulate a certain amount, my dear Fanny. He only requested me to assist them in general terms. I promised to make their situation better, so this promise should be kept. When they leave Norland and settle in a new home, I must do something for them." "Well, dear, let something be done for them, but that can be something instead of money. Think once, when your sisters are married, the money will be gone forever, and your little son may regret that so a large sum was parted with." "So maybe we can decrease the amount, dear." "Oh, it would be great for all of us." "I do not want to be considered as mean. With this amount, no one, even my sisters, cannot expect more from me. I may afford to give them £500 apiece, and on their mother's death they will receive £3,000 more, which makes a very comfortable fortune for any young woman." "Certainly," replied his wife, "but we must not allow them anything yearly. In some years it can be very inconvenient to spare £100 from our expenses. I am sure that your father did not mean giving money to them at all. He meant, for instance, helping them to find a little house, helping them move their things and sending them presents. I am sure that he did not mean anything more. They will comfortably live on the interest of £7,000 besides the money of the girls. They will have 500 a year. What on earth can 4 women want more than that? They will have no carriage, no horses or servants. As they will not have company, they will not have any expenses. Think of it, dear. Your sisters and mother-in-law will be much more able to give you something than you do." "You are right," replied John Dashwood. "My father certainly did not mean money only. I will assist them in their works and be kind to them every time. When my mother moves to another house, I will help them, maybe give them some little furniture too." This argument would never end. Mr. John Dashwood suggested one thing and then found it absolutely unnecessary, under the influence of his wife's ideas. Finally, they resolved that the kind treatment would be quite enough for the widow and her daughters. Chapter 2. ELINOR and Edward Ferrars. Mrs. Dashwood and the girls stayed at Norland for several months. She was already looking forward to leaving the house, and detested living under the same roof with her daughter-in-law. As for leaving Norland, that beloved spot and lovely place of distant memories, she unfortunately could not hear of any suitable dwelling in near surrounding. Although Mrs. John Dashwood treated them with great politeness, the 2 ladies found it impossible to live together so long. Meanwhile, there were signs of a kind of attachment between ELINOR and Edward Ferrars, Mrs. John Dashwood's brother. He was a gentlemanlike, good-humored young man, who came to Norland after his sister moved there and spent a long time there. He was the eldest son of a man who died very rich and left his family a great deal of money. However, all this fortune depended on the will of his mother. Though not handsome, he was sincere in his nature, but due to lack of intimacy, his manners were not perceived as pleasing. But when he overcame his shyness, he behaved in an open, affectionate way. His understanding was good, and his behaviors were respectful. Moreover, his education highly improved him. However, all these were not sufficient for his mother or sisters, who wished to see him in a more striking position. His mother actually wanted him to be engaged in politics. Mrs. John Dashwood wished the same. But Edward had no inclination for being a great man. He merely wanted domestic comfort and a quiet private life. During his visit at Norland Park for several weeks, he attracted Mrs. Dashwood's attention. She observed this quiet young man with a growing affection. "He is unlike Fanny, that is enough. I like him, he is so amiable," said she, and wanted to encourage ELINOR to talk of it. "Like him! Is there no sentiment like love?" replied she with a smile. The mother was very eager to get acquainted with Edward. When she noticed a single indicator of love in his behavior to ELINOR, she regarded their attachment as certain. "My dear Marianne," she said, whispering, "in a few months ELINOR will be married. We will certainly miss her, but she will be happy, I am sure." "Oh, mamma, what will we do without her?" "My love, it will not be a real separation, since we will live in a few miles from each other and meet every day. You will gain a real affectionate brother. But you do not look happy. Don't you approve of your sister's choice?" "I am surprised, mamma. Edward is very friendly. I love him too. But his figure is not handsome, and he is not the proper kind of man. His eyes are lack of spirit, virtue, and intelligence. Worst of all, he has no real taste, mamma. Music hardly attracts him. Besides, though he admires Elinor's drawing much, he does not seem as if he really understands it. In fact, he knows nothing of the matter. He admires as a lover, not as a specialist. I personally cannot be happy with a man like Edward, who does not share the same tastes as me. We must enjoy the same music and authors. Oh, how spiritless he was when he read to us last night. I felt sorry for my sister, but she seemed to be unaware of it. He uttered those beautiful lines with such a dreadful indifference. He would certainly have done better if you gave him a single and elegant prose, my dear. No, mamma, as Elinor does not share my feelings, she may ignore it. But if I had loved him, I would be desperately sorry and disappointed. I shall never know a man who shares my taste, mamma. It's too early for you to think of marriage, my dear. Why should your destiny be different from Elinor's?" Marianne revealed her ideas about Edward to Elinor when they were alone, thus raising the opportunity to acquire her sister's feelings. "Edward has no real taste for drawing. What a pity," she said. "No taste? What makes you think so?" Elinor was surprised to hear it. "He does not draw himself, but enjoys watching other people's drawing, and to be sure, he has a natural taste. It is unfortunate for him that he had no chance to improve it, otherwise he would have drawn very well. As he does not thrust his own judgment in these matters, he always keeps his ideas to himself on any picture." Seeing that Elinor was a little offended, Marianne did not say a word against the subject. "I did not mean to hurt your feelings, dear Elinor, and I had no chance of knowing him better yet. To be sure, he is of a friendly character, and very kind towards us all. His good understanding and his principles are concealed by his shyness, which keeps him silent often. I have seen a great deal of him, Marianne. I have studied his sentiments. As for his ideas on literature and taste, I am sure that he is well informed. He has a lively imagination and correct observations, in addition to delicate and pure taste. I know that he is hardly handsome, but when the expression of his eyes and sweetness of his countenance are perceived, your impression changes. Now, as I know him so well, I find him really handsome. What do you think now, Marianne? I am sure in a short time, when I know him better, I will like him too, Elinor. I confess," continues Elinor, "that I think very highly of him, and I like him." "You like him? You are cold-hearted, Elinor. Is the word like the true one really?" Elinor could not help laughing. "Believe me that my feelings are much more stronger than I declared. But do not forget that I am not fully assured of his regard for me. As for him, there are times when he is sentimental, but there is a problem in fact. He is not independent from his mother. Fanny told me that if Edward wishes to marry a woman who had neither a great deal of fortune or rank, he will face many difficulties." "And you are not engaged to him?" asked Marianne. "Yet this certainly will soon take place." Even though her mother and sister considered it as certain, Elinor was far from being sure of Edward's feelings. Sometimes when they were together, she believed that their relation was nothing more than friendship. When this probable attachment was perceived by Mrs. John Dashwood, she behaved in an uncivil way, to make Mrs. Dashwood uneasy, and expressively talked about their mother's great expectations. Mrs. Ferrars made a resolution that his sons should marry well. On this occasion Mrs. Dashwood gave her an answer and left the room, trying to keep her beloved Elinor away from humiliation. At that time she received a letter from a cousin, Sir John. It was an offer of a small house in Devonshire. The letter was written in a very friendly way, leaving no room for slightest doubt or concern. Though the house was only a cottage, he was making sure that anything would be done to approve it. Then he earnestly wanted them to visit the house to see the garden and the building. As Mrs. Dashwood had no time to further inquire, she happily decided to accept the kind offer. At present, quitting Norland was no longer worrying, but something desired for her. Being unwanted guests of her daughter-in-law was miserable, so she quickly wrote back to Sir John Middleton, saying that she kindly accepted his sincere offer, and showed the letter to her daughters. After the letter was sent, Mrs. Dashwood happily announced her son-in-law and daughter-in-law that she had found a house and would no longer stay with them until everything was arranged. Mrs. John Dashwood said nothing, but her husband sincerely hoped that they would not be settled far from Norland. When Mrs. Dashwood replied that they would go to Devonshire with great satisfaction, Edward exclaimed with surprise, "Devonshire, so far from here!" She kindly invited him and Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood to visit them in Barton. Mr. John Dashwood felt really vexed for their departure to a far place. Besides, he was uneasy for not being able to keep his promise to his father. The house at Barton was already furnished by their servants, 2 maids and a man who were sent to the house in advance. Finally, in a few weeks, everything was ready at Barton, and the journey was to begin. In their farewell to the beloved place, lovely garden, and the house which was full of good memories, they could not help crying. "Dear, dear Norland," said Marianne, "how will I miss you! I will see you no more, maybe." Chapter 3. New House, New Friends. At first their journey was melancholic and boring, but as they came near to Barton Valley and began to feel impatient, it was a nice, pleasant place with woods and fertile pastures. After a mile they reached their new house, Barton Cottage, which, despite being small and a bit old, was comfortable and neat. There was a sitting room in each side of the entrance, 4 bedrooms and 2 garrets, offices and stairs. In comparison to Norland, it was poor and small. As it was early in September, the weather was fine. Seeing the place in good weather, they quickly loved it. The house overlooked the whole of the valley, with all its green hills and pastures. Although the house needed some improvements and repair, it was all enough for them. But for the spring Mrs. Dashwood planned to add new buildings and wanted to enlarge the parlors for parties. Besides, the stair needed widening and window shutters needed paint. The next day after breakfast, Sir John Middleton called to welcome them in Barton Cottage and to kindly invite them to his house. He was a good-looking, friendly man of 40 years. He cordially insisted them to dine at his house until they were properly settled at home. And as if to prove his kindness, he sent a large basket full of fruit and vegetables after his departure. His wife, Lady Middleton, also sent a civil message and came to visit them the next day. She was 36 or 7 years old, with a beautiful countenance. Her manners were full of elegance, but lacked of warmth and sincerity. Though being very kind and civil, she was rather cold and reserved. In fact, she was a true mother, passionate for her children and a successful housewife. From their aspect, Sir John was very chatty, but his wife seemed uninterested in any topic other than her children. Barton Park, the house of Middletons, was about a mile from the cottage. The house was nice and large, and happily for Sir John, it was scarcely left without any visitors. Lady Middleton's elegance and Sir John's friendly manners attracted so many visitors and guests to dine or stay at Barton Park. Sir John was really delighted on seeing the house crowded. The arrival of a new family naturally made him even happier and excited. He found Mrs. Dashwoods very pretty and well-bred, and showed his kindness to his cousins at every opportunity. Mrs. Dashwood and the daughters were met at the door by Sir John, who sincerely welcomed them. While accompanying them to the drawing-room, he hoped that they would excuse the smallness of the company, as he had only 2 visitors in the house at that moment. One of them was Mrs. Jennings, Lady Middleton's mother, who was a fat, merry, and elderly woman. She talked much, seemed happy and good-humored. Full of jokes and laughter, she said many vulgar things on lovers, and openly asked the girls if they had left their hearts at Norland Park. She was even happier to see them blush. Marianne at first was very uneasy, and felt sorry for ELINOR, and ELINOR, thinking of Edward, was able to reserve her serenity, not to show her feelings. The other guest was Colonel Brandon, Sir John's friend, who seemed very silent and grave. Being 35 and still single, Marianne and Margaret found him as a true bachelor. His face was not handsome at all, but his eyes were sensible and his manners were agreeable. In the evening, on discovering that Marianne was musical, they insisted her to play. At the end of every song, Sir John loudly conveyed his admiration, and Lady Middleton asked her to sing a particular song which Marianne had already sung. Only Colonel Brandon attentively listened, and Marianne respected him for this. When compared to horrible insensibility of others, his taste in music was estimable. Mrs. Jennings had only 2 daughters who were respectably married, therefore her only job was to marry the rest of the world. Very quick in discovering attachments and love affairs between young girls and men, she waited for a blush in their face at every opportunity. Soon after arriving at Barton, she said that Colonel Brandon was very much in love with Marianne. It must be so, she was sure of it. As the man was rich and the girl was beautiful, it would be an excellent match. She had always been anxious to get a good husband for every pretty girl. Mrs. Dashwood, on the other hand, could not think of a man of that age who would be attached to her 17-year-old daughter, and discussed it with Elinor. 35 and 17 don't have anything to do with matrimony, but if Marianne was 10 years older, there could be no objection for marrying Colonel Brandon. After their discussion about Colonel Brandon and Marianne, Elinor quit the room, then Marianne came in with an anxious countenance. "Mamma," said she, "I think Edward Ferrars is not well. Since we moved here, he did not come to visit us. What can possibly detain him from coming here? Why is he still in Norland? What makes him stay there? Does Elinor already expect him? I did not ask her, but of course she must be wondering too. Do you remember how cold their adieus were? Elinor did not cry as much as I did. In Edward's farewell, he was equally civil to me and Elinor, not more affectionate to Elinor. What does it mean?" Chapter 4. Introduction of Mr. Willoughby. The Dashwoods were now settled at Barton in a comfortable way. With all surrounding objects, the house and the garden were all familiar to them now. Each day, Sir John Middleton was amazed on finding them always occupied. Generally, Mrs. Dashwood declined to visit any family beyond distance of walk, despite Sir John's efforts to make them use his carriage. The cottage was situated on a hill which overlooked the whole country. The green pastures invited them to take walks in near surrounding. Margaret and Marianne, attracted by partial sunshine, walked towards the hills. They happily ascended the hills, and pitied that Elinor and their mother did not join them. "Is there a felicity in the world more than this?" asked Marianne with great joy. "We will walk here at least for 2 hours." Margaret agreed, and they continued walking against the wind for 20 minutes, when suddenly raindrops set their face. They were surprised, unwillingly turned back, running with all their speed down the steep side of the hill. Marianne had a false step while passing the hill, and all of a sudden fell on the ground. Just at that time, a young gentleman was passing up the hill on horseback. Seeing the desperate accident, he swiftly put his gun down and ran for help. Marianne raised from the ground, but her ankle had been twisted. The gentleman took her up in his arms without further delay and carried her down the hill. Passing through the gate, he stepped directly in the house. On sudden entrance of a stranger, Elinor and Mrs. Dashwood rose up in amazement, their eyes fixed on this mysterious young man who apologized for coming in a rash. He then quickly related its cause and retold the accident in brief. In doing this, he was so frank and graceful that Mrs. Dashwood was even more interested in this stranger. Thanking him again and again for his kindness, she invited him to be seated with a sweet address, but he kindly declined this as he was dirty and wet. Then Mrs. Dashwood begged to know his name. His name was Willoughby, and his present home was at Allenham. He hoped they would allow him the honor of calling tomorrow to inquire about Miss Dashwood. His wish was readily accepted, and then he departed and disappeared in the midst of rain. This unknown young man was the matter of discussion from that time. His manly beauty and gracefulness was greatly admired by all. As for Marianne, she blushed on remembering his lifting her up and carrying her to the house in his strong arms. His elegance and air was equal to a hero of a favorite story. All his qualities were interesting. His name, his residence, and the way he dressed was all good. The next morning when Sir John called them, Mrs. Dashwood eagerly asked him whether he knew that gentleman named Willoughby at Allenham. "Willoughby!" he cried. "Why, is he in the country? Good news! What kind of a man is he?" "A good fellow indeed, I assure you. A bold rider and a decent hunter, really." "Is that all you can say for him?" she protested. Sir John looked rather puzzled. "Oh, I do not know him as to know all of this, but he is pleasant and good-honored." "And who is he?" asked Elinor. "Where does he come from? Has he got a house at Allenham?" On these matters Sir John did not give them certain answers. They learned that Mr. Willoughby had no property of his own in the country, that he resided there only while he was visiting the old lady at Allenham, who was a relative of his. He was to inherit the whole possession of the old lady. I think he has a little estate in Somersetshire, but Miss Marianne must not expect to have all the men to herself. Brandon will be jealous. He is a good fellow. Last Christmas he danced from 8 o'clock to 4 without once sitting down. Really, that is what a young man should be. He should show his pursuits and eagerness without any moderation and fatigue. Yes, but you never think of poor Brandon as far as I see. Sir John, I particularly dislike this kind of expression. Chapter 5. Marianne Falls in Love. Early the next morning, Willoughby called at the cottage to make inquiries about Marianne. Miss Dashwood politely received him, trying to assure him of their elegance, mutual affection, and domestic comfort. Miss Elinor Dashwood had a pretty figure with a delicate complexion and regular features, and Marianne was quite a beauty, even handsomer. Her form was more striking, and her face was very lovely. In her dark eyes there was life, spirit, and delight. They looked with eagerness. When she saw Willoughby again, she at first became very shy on remembering their first meeting, but when she learned that he was very fond of dance and music, this embarrassment quickly faded away. She could not be silent at such matters. On discovering that they both liked dancing and music, Marianne was no longer shy or reserved. By further examining his ideas about books, she surprisingly found that their taste was strikingly alike. The same books, the same passages and lines, were very much liked by both of them. When any kind of difference aroused, it was quickly settled by enthusiastic looks of Marianne. When Willoughby left, Elinor conveyed her thoughts on their relation. "Well, Marianne, you have known every opinion of Mr. Willoughby already, but in all this wide range of topics, you will soon be tired of each topic. You discussed on many matters that you will have nothing to talk about later." "Why do you think so, Elinor? Are my ideas only limited to books and music? I know I have been too much frank and eager, where I should have been reserved and dull. I have been open and sincere. But this is what I prefer to do." On the other hand, Willoughby came to them every day. At first, asking Marianne's health was an excuse, but after her full recovery he did not need to produce excuses, because the family received him with equal affection. He was a young man with lively spirits and good abilities. Just like Marianne, he was open and genuine, and all of these qualities were enough to captivate Marianne, when added to his quite handsome figure. In a short time, being with Willoughby became Marianne's best enjoyment. They read, talked, and sang together for hours. His musical talents were considerate, and he read with spirit and sensibility, an ability which unfortunately Edward did not have. While Mrs. Dashwood found their new friend very lovely and reliable, Elinor was disturbed of this frankness in a few cases. He hastily gave his opinions of other people without taking general politeness into account, and wanted to be a favorite every time. However, her mother was already making plans of marriage before the end of a week, and secretly congratulated herself for gaining such respectable sons-in-laws as Edward and Willoughby. As for Colonel Brandon's affection for Marianne, it was quickly discovered by his friend and Elinor. Now, with the introduction of Willoughby, were Colonel Brandon and Willoughby in a state of rivalry? She saw it with concern. When opposed to a 25-year-old lively man like Willoughby, what could a silent man of 35 hope? She liked him, despite his gravity and reserved behaviors. Her manners were mild. The situation appeared to be a result of some past injuries rather than natural gloominess of temper. Elinor regarded him with respect. Perhaps she even felt sorry for him, because Marianne and Willoughby prejudiced against him for being older and undervalued his merits. When the Dashwoods first moved to Devonshire, they did not imagine that they could be occupied by too many engagements. When Marianne recovered, the plans of enjoyment were done. In the park, private balls began, bringing all the acquaintances closer. In every meeting of this kind, Willoughby was invited, and he was given the opportunity to witness the merits of Marianne as far as possible. Elinor was not surprised at their attachment, nor she detested the situation. She only wished that it was less openly shown. When she for a few times tried to recommend this to Marianne, she found it unnecessary and disgraceful. Self-command and any other concealment of emotions were not suitable for Marianne and Willoughby. All the time, their ideas were the same. Everything Willoughby did was right, everything he said was clever. When dancing was formed, they were partners, and when they were separate they did not speak a word to anyone else. All of this conduct, of course, made them laughed at, especially by Mrs. Jennings, but they did not pay the slightest attention. This was a season of happiness for Marianne. Her heart was devoted to Willoughby, which made forgetting nice memories of Norland less painful. She was truly enjoying the charms and excitement of the present day. As for Elinor, she was not so much at ease. Neither Lady Middleton nor Mrs. Jennings could give her amusement by conversation. Although she found Mrs. Jennings really kind, being an everlasting speaker, Elinor had already listened to her story for 3 times. Lady Middleton was more agreeable than her mother, but she was more silent. She only cared for her children and her husband with real affection, not being rude or spiritless to other people. Among these new friends, Elinor only respected Colonel Brandon, whose abilities deserved to be defined as respectful. His conversation and companion gave pleasure to her. Willoughby was out of the question. Even his regard and affection was artificial. As for other people's ideas and sentiments, his indifference was as great as Marianne's. Colonel Brandon unfortunately could not think of Marianne, as he could not find encouragement on Willoughby's presence. However, Elinor's compassion for him increased. She even pitied him when he fixed his eyes on Marianne, as they were sitting at Barton Park. A total change of sentiments, romantic expectations of a young and lively mind are obliged to change, which is too dangerous. I speak from experience. I once knew a lady who very much resembled your sister in temper and mind, who judged and thought like her, but she had to change her mind due to some undesired and unfortunate circumstances. Here he suddenly stopped as if regretting, for he had said too much. Elinor asked no more, but it was clear that this man had an unwanted experience. The next morning, Marianne told Elinor with great joy that Willoughby had given her a horse, which he himself bred at Summitshire. Without even thinking the extra burden of keeping a horse in the cottage, she told about the qualities of the animal, that it was just for carrying a woman, and it was very kind of Willoughby to give such a present. But after listening to Elinor's reasonable grounds for their not being able to keep a horse, Marianne's joy faded. They would need an additional servant. Besides, receiving such a present from a man who was so lately known to her would not be suitable at all. "You are now mistaken, Elinor," said she warmly. "Indeed, I do not know Willoughby long, but I am much better acquainted with him than any other man in the world. Sometimes long years would not be sufficient to know each other, but in 7 days you can learn all you need." The next day, when Willoughby called at the cottage, Marianne kept her promise, and Elinor heard her conveying the situation to Willoughby. "But Marianne, the horse is still yours. I will keep it until you can use it. When you leave Barton to your own establishment in a more lasting home, the horse will be waiting for you." On hearing this conversation, and seeing that his manner in pronouncing the sentence and his addressing Marianne by her Christian name only, Elinor no longer doubted that they were engaged to each other, which did not surprise her at all. In addition, the next day, Margaret related something important to her, which made things even clearer. "Oh, Elinor," she cried, "I have such a secret to tell you about Marianne. I am sure she will be married to Mr. Willoughby very soon, because Willoughby got a lock of her hair. Take care, Margaret, it may be a hair of some other person. But indeed, Elinor, it's Marianne's. I saw him cut it off. Last night after tea, when you and Mamma were out, they were whispering and talking very fast. Mr. Willoughby seemed as if begging for something. Then he took up scissors and cut off a lock of hair from Marianne. He then kissed it and folded it up in a piece of paper, then put it into his pocket." Margaret's childish nature was sometimes displayed in a dangerous way. One evening, when Mrs. Jennings attacked her to give the name of the young man who was Elinor's favorite, Margaret looked at Elinor, then answered, "I must not tell. May I, Elinor?" This made everybody, including Elinor, laugh. But the effort was painful. Turning very red, she answered, "Whatever you make up, you should not repeat them, Margaret." "I did not make up. You told me yourself." This made Mrs. Jennings laugh, and she further pressed her to tell the name. "I cannot tell you, madame, but I am very well sure that his name begins with an F." Elinor felt grateful to Lady Middleton when she told that it rained very hard. The topic easily changed, but Elinor could not recover from the first alarm easily. That evening a party was formed for going on a very fine place belonging to Colonel Brandon's brother-in-law, about 12 miles to Barton. All the things were settled for the following day. However, their expected excursion to Whitewell turned out very differently. By 10 o'clock everybody was present at the park for breakfast. Although it had rained all night, the morning was rather favorable. They were all in high spirits and good humor. At breakfast letters were brought. One was for Colonel Brandon. He took it, changed color, and immediately left the room. "What is the matter with Colonel?" asked Sir John. "I hope he had no bad news," said Lady Middleton. As Colonel Brandon entered the room, "No bad news, I hope, Colonel," said Mrs. Jennings. "Thank you, madame. It came from town, merely a letter of business." "But how did it make you so uneasy? Come on, Colonel, let us hear the truth. Is it about your cousin? Is she getting married?" asked Mrs. Jennings with curiosity. "No, indeed it is not. I am very sorry, madame," he said to Lady Middleton, "that I should leave Barton immediately as this business requires my attendance in town." "In town?" cried Mrs. Jennings. "At this time of the year?" "I am obliged to leave such a nice party. Besides, I am more concerned that you will not be admitted to Whitwell without me." This surprised everybody once more. "We must go," said Sir John. "Consider, everyone assembled here to go there. You can go tomorrow." "It is not in my power to delay my journey for one day." "If you would let us know what your business is, maybe we can consider whether it would be delayed or not," said Mrs. Jennings, still insisting to learn. "You can go 6 hours later," said Willoughby, "until our return from Whitwell." "I cannot afford to lose 1 hour," replied Colonel Brandon firmly. Meanwhile, Elinor heard Willoughby whisper to Marianne, "Brandon is such a man who cannot bear a party of pleasure. I am sure he was afraid of catching a cold, and invented this trick for getting out of it." "I have no doubt of it," answered Marianne. "Well then, you will not change your mind, Brandon, when you are determined," said Sir John, and Colonel Brandon again repeated his sorrow at the beginning of the party, and disappointed them for not being able to take them to Whitwell. "When will you come back?" Lady Middleton asked. "It is not certain, madame." "Is there a change of meeting you and your sister in town this winter, Miss Dashwood?" asked Colonel Brandon to Elinor. "I am afraid not. So I must say good-bye," he said, and only nodded to Marianne, left the room. "I can guess what this business is," said Mrs. Jennings after he went out. "It must be about Miss Williams, I am sure." "Who is she?" asked Marianne. "What? Don't you know her? She is a relation of his, a very near relation." Then whispering to Elinor, she said, "She is his natural daughter." "Indeed?" "Yes, and Colonel will leave her all his fortune, I guess." After unexpected departure of Colonel Brandon, Sir John regretted that this inconvenience happened, and as they were already together, suggested that they should do some other thing to enjoy themselves. It was agreed that they could go driving around the country. The carriages were ordered, and Marianne never looked happier when she first got into Willoughby's carriage. They drove past the park very fast, and nothing was heard of them until their return. In the evening a dance was settled at the park. On the dinner table Willoughby took his usual seat between Marianne and Elinor. Mrs. Jennings sat next to Elinor, and leaning back behind her said to Marianne, "I know where you spent the whole morning." "Where?" asked Marianne, with a blush in her face. "I hope you liked your house, Miss Marianne. It's a very large one, I know, and when I come to visit you, I hope you will have newly furnished it." Marianne again turned red, while Mrs. Jennings laughed heartily. Elinor learned that they had been to Allenham and spent a considerable time there in the house and in the garden. It was hard to believe, because Mrs. Smith must be in the house during her visit. How could Willoughby propose such a thing, and how could Marianne accept this? As soon as they were alone, Elinor found that anything Mrs. Jennings said was true. But Marianne was quite angry when Elinor inquired her about this. "Why should we not go there, Elinor? Isn't it what you often wished yourself?" "Yes, Marianne, but Mrs. Smith was there. Was not she?" "Mr. Willoughby is the only person who has the right to show the house. It was the most pleasant morning I have ever lived." "But, my dear, it had already caused you some impertinent remarks, you know." "If you mean Mrs. Jennings' remarks are proof of impropriety of conduct, then we are all offending. I do not value her words. I have done nothing wrong in seeing the house. One day they will be Mr. Willoughby's, and—" "If they were to be yours, Marianne, you should make a fair judgment of your ill conduct." She blushed, and after a few minutes of sensible thinking, came to her sister to say that the idea of going to Allenham was rather wrong. But Willoughby very much wanted to show the place, and it was such a charming house with all its comfortable furniture and stairs and curtains. Since Colonel Brandon's sudden departure, Mrs. Jennings was wondering about its possible causes. Being a great wonderer, she always took greatest interest in all private conducts of her friends. Elinor hoped that Colonel would get rid of the problem as soon as possible. While everyone was concerned for Colonel, Marianne and Willoughby did not pay the slightest attention. Willoughby's behavior toward Marianne was the clearest sight of his attachment, and Marianne was already in love with him. She thought that Willoughby showed all tenderness of a lover's heart without any hesitation. He considered the cottage as his house and spent many hours there. The warm heart of Mrs. Jennings always welcomed him. Chapter 6. Willoughby leaves Marianne. The next day, Mrs. Dashwood visited Lady Middleton with Margaret and Elinor, but due to some trifling works in the house, Marianne preferred to stay at home. When they returned from the park, they found Willoughby's servant and carriage in front of the cottage. Entering the house, something unexpected happened. Marianne quickly came out of the room in a violent manner and ran upstairs with her handkerchief in her eyes. They directly proceeded in the room in alarm and found Willoughby there alone. He turned round with a serious expression in his face. "What's the matter with her? Is she ill?" cried Mrs. Dashwood. "I hope not," replied Willoughby, trying to look cheerful. "But I expect to be ill myself, as I am suffering under a hard disappointment." "What disappointment?" "I am unable to keep my engagement with you, Mrs. Dashwood. Mrs. Smith is sending me to London on business. I have just taken my farewell to Allenham, and came to say good-bye to you." "How unfortunate! I hope your business will not detain you from us long." "You are very kind, but I have no idea of turning to Devonshire immediately. I will not visit Mrs. Smith in a year," he said, colouring. "I will not torment myself any longer by remaining among friends, whom I will be missing very much." Then he quickly left the room and left them. There was something embarrassing in his manners, which were so disturbing. He behaved just unlike himself, so reserved and unwilling. Elinor feared that something serious had happened between Marianne and him, so suddenly gone. Last night he was so happy, so affectionate, and 10 minutes ago he went without any intention of returning. Could they have quarrelled? When Elinor said that Willoughby had been rude towards them, her mother violently rejected the idea, saying that he would have valid reasons to do so. "There can be such inconveniences between lovers," she said. "Last night did not his behaviours toward Marianne show that he loved and considered her as his future wife? Did not he mean that he felt for us the attachment of the nearest relation? My Elinor, is it possible to doubt Willoughby's affection for Marianne? You should not think ill of him. Indeed, he loves her, I am sure, but if he can leave her with such indifference, this is strange. I love Willoughby sincerely, and suspicion equally hurts me. I was startled by the difference in his manners, that is all. He just parted from Marianne, leaving her in an improper way. He did not even insist in soothing her." "You are right. Willoughby certainly does not deserve to be suspected, my dear. Although we do not know him very long, he is not a stranger to us." They were interrupted by Margaret, and Marianne did not appear until dinner time. She took her place at the table without saying a word, sat with red eyes. Carefully avoiding their looks, she neither ate nor spoke. After some time, when her mother pressed her hand warmly, she burst into tears and left the room. The first night after Willoughby's departure, Marianne, being unable to sleep, stayed awake and wept the whole night, and in the morning woke up with a headache. Knowing that she was giving pain to her mother and sisters by this situation, she still refused any consolation. After breakfast she walked by herself around the village of Allenham, and added to her grief by remembering past joys. In the evening she played their favourite song in the piano, sang and wept for her lost love. In a few days her melancholy calmed down, as Elinor and Mrs. Dashwood observed. No letter arrived from Willoughby. Elinor was uneasy again, but her mother, as usual, was able to find explanations, and thus satisfied herself with positive interpretations. On one occasion, however, it was clear that Marianne was expecting Willoughby to return. One morning, as 3 sisters were taking a walk around the country, they saw a man on horseback riding toward them. "I know! It is him indeed!" she exclaimed, running toward to meet him. "No, Marianne, you are mistaken. It is not Willoughby." "No, it's him!" she said, eagerly walking on. Then, seeing that it was not Willoughby, but Edward Ferrars, she turned back. The sisters warmly welcomed him, and Marianne thought that Edward's coming would be an opportunity to continue their relationship. However, Edward lacked any indication of a lover. He did not even seem happy at all to see them, looked confused, and did not show any special attention to Elinor. Learning that he was not coming from London, but he had been in Devonshire for a fortnight without directly coming to see Elinor, Marianne felt sorry for Elinor. Mrs. Dashwood welcomed Edward kindly, and after dinner she asked him about his future plans. "My wishes are as moderate as any other people. Everyone wants to be happy, but of course everyone has different perceptions of happiness. I know that my talents do not meet wishes of my mother. I am so foolishly shy that I am often misunderstood," he said. Elinor was worried to see him unhappy, so she had very little satisfaction from his visit. She wished he showed his evident feelings for her, like in Norland, but until now everything was uncertain, due to Edward's pointless, reserved manners. When they were having tea, Marianne saw a ring in Edward's finger, with a plait of hair in the center. "I never saw you wear a ring before, Edward," she cried. "Is that Fanny's hair? I remember she promised to give you some. But was not her hair darker than this?" Realizing how much pain she gave to Edward, Marianne felt ashamed and tried to keep silent for the rest of the day. "Yes, it is my sister's hair," replied Edward, with a trembling voice. He colored deeply, and could not avoid looking at Elinor's eyes for a second. Elinor secretly looked at the ring first, then to his eyes. The hair was her own, she was sure. It was exactly her own hair. Satisfying herself with the idea, she almost forgot all cold behaviors of Edward. Chapter 7. Elinor Inquires About Willoughby. Edward stayed at the cottage for a week, and although Mrs. Dashwood sincerely insisted in his staying longer, he kindly rejected this offer. During the last 2 or 3 days, his temper changed strikingly. He became more and more interested in the house and the garden. Praising the environment, he never spoke of going away without being sorrowful, but he said that he must go. He was very happy to be able to see them, and valued their kindness beyond anything. The next day at breakfast, Mrs. Dashwood asked Edward about his future plans. "I've always preferred the church. I still do. But you know that was not smart enough for my family. We could never agree on my profession. I had no inclination in law, and as far for the Navy, I am too old to become engaged with it now." "Know your happiness," continued Mrs. Dashwood. "You need nothing but patience. Your mother will secure you in time. It is her duty to enable you for your independence." The parting of Edward shortly took place and gave Elinor additional grief, but she was determined to conceal it. Naturally, her trouble needed some time to subdue, and she had the ability to tackle with it on her own. In order to prevent herself looking miserable, she engaged herself with daily jobs. As soon as Edward left, she directly sat down to her drawing table and busily employed herself the whole day. Yet her ability to conceal her suffering from other members of the family did not help her forget Edward. She had enough time to think of him, with doubt, pity, affection, and pain. One morning, while she was alone drawing, Sir John, Lady Middleton, and Mrs. Jennings called at the cottage with 2 strangers in their company. She was then introduced to this couple, the Palmers, who turned out to be other daughter and son-in-law of Mrs. Jennings. Mrs. Palmer was several years younger than Lady Middleton, and was totally unlike her in every aspect. Her manners could not be defined as elegant, yet she was much more sincere and good-humored. Like her mother, she always kept smiling and making jokes. His husband, on the other hand, was a grave-looking man, who had no inclination to be pleased or to please others. They spent a few hours at the cottage, and as usual, Sir John insisted for them to dine with them at Barton Park the next day. Despite the unwillingness of Mrs. Dashwood, Mrs. Palmer and Sir John begged them to come. The next day, when the same party gathered at Barton Park, they talked about the weather, and Mrs. Palmer again praised the beauty and kindness of Miss Dashwood's. She even invited them to her house in winter. When the subject was changed, "I am afraid Miss Marianne did not take her usual walk to Allenham today," said Sir John with a smile. Marianne looked very grave and did not answer. "Oh, do not be shy, dear," said Mrs. Palmer, "because we know all the particulars, and I assure you I very much admire your taste. He is very handsome, I know, as we live about 10 miles away from each other in the country." Marianne remained silent, but her face betrayed her curiosity to know more about Willoughby. Then in the sitting room, having the opportunity to be left alone with Mrs. Palmer, Elinor inquired about Willoughby. "Oh dear, I know him very well," replied Mrs. Palmer. "Indeed, I had never spoken to him, but I see him in town, and we have seen him in Somersetshire. I know why you inquire about him, because your sister will marry him. I am very glad of it, really. Everyone finds him agreeable, and he is liked by everyone whenever he goes. Tell your sister that she is very lucky for such a match." Although Mrs. Palmer's knowledge of Mr. Willoughby was limited, Elinor was pleased to hear good things about him. Chapter 8. Lucy Steele. The next day, the Palmers turned back to Cleveland, and the two families were left to themselves again. At least, Elinor thought so, and this situation did not last long. In one morning excursion to Exeter, the Middletons met two young ladies, and when Mrs. Jennings had the chance of discovering that they were her relations, it was enough for Sir John to invite them to his house. When the young ladies arrived, their appearance was fashionable and smart. Their manners were very civil, and they were delighted with the house and furniture. Especially when they happened to be fond of children, Lady Middleton's good opinion was guaranteed. After their arrival, Sir John quickly set off for the cottage, to tell Miss Dashwoods of the arrival of Miss Steele. When their promised visit to the park was paid, they were introduced to these young ladies. The eldest one, Anne, was nearly 30, and her face was plain and did not look very sensible. But the younger was quite a beauty. Her face was pretty, and she had a sharp, quick eye, which gave her a fake elegance or grace. Their manners were particularly civil. "How do you like Devonshire, Miss Dashwood? I suppose you are very sorry to leave Sussex. Norland is an excellent place, isn't it?" asked Lucy Steele. "Yes, I think everyone admires it," replied Elinor. "No one can estimate its beauties better than we do." "And had you a smart beau there?" asked the elder one. "But you may think that there are not as many genteel young men in Devonshire as Sussex?" said Lucy, looking ashamed of her sister's words. These were enough for Elinor to know these young ladies. The folly and vulgarity of the eldest and the shrewd look of the younger needed no further questioning, so she left the house with no wish to know them better. But Miss Steele's did not think so. Every day, Sir John was able to persuade them to come to Barton Park, thus creating an unwanted conversation between the ladies. At one of these occasions, as Elinor feared, Miss Steele's had now all the benefits of vulgar jokes of Sir John and Mrs. Jennings, and Sir John had pleasure of telling the name with F, in an audible whisper. "His name is Ferrars," he said, "but please do not tell. It is a secret." "Ferrars!" replied Miss Steele. "What? Your sister-in-law's brother, Miss Dashwood? He is a very agreeable man. I know him well." "How can you say so, Anne?" cried Lucy Steele. "We may have seen him once or twice at my uncle's, so we cannot say that we know him well." Elinor heard this with surprise. Who was this uncle? The way Lucy talked of Edward made her even curious. Although Sir John openly mentioned Edward Ferrars' name, Miss Lucy Steele took no notice of it. Lucy was naturally clever, her remarks were generally amusing as a companion. Elinor even found her agreeable, but her qualities of lacked education, and thus her mental improvement was not completed. Elinor pitied her for the neglect of abilities, which would certainly have flourished. Chapter 9. The Secret Engagement. One day, as they were walking together, Lucy asked, "You may find my question rather an odd one, but please say, are you personally acquainted with your sister-in-law's mother, Mrs. Ferrars?" Elinor really found the question very odd, while answering that she did not. "Indeed," replied Lucy, "as you have lived at Norland, I thought perhaps you could tell me what sort of a woman she is." "No, I do not know her," replied Elinor. "I'm sure you find my inquiries rather strange. You are right," said Lucy, carefully watching Elinor's face. "I do not want you to think me of curious, and I am sure I have not the smallest fear of trusting you. In fact, I would appreciate your advice on the matter. I am sorry that you do not know Mrs. Ferrars. If it could be of any use to know my opinion of her, I am sorry I do not know her, but indeed I did not understand how you were connected to the family at all. Therefore, to tell the truth, I am a little bit surprised." "It is natural that you wonder," went on Lucy. "Mrs. Ferrars is certainly nothing to me at present, but in the future, I do not know when, we may be very intimately connected." "Good heavens!" cried Elinor. "What do you mean? Are you acquainted with Robert Ferrars? Can you be?" "No," replied Lucy, "not with Robert Ferrars. I never saw him in my life, "But his elder brother," said she, fixing her eyes directly on Elinor. Elinor turned toward Lucy in silent amazement, unable to utter a word, but still stood firmly. What did she really feel? How painful was it to her? "You may be well surprised, because you could have no idea of it before, as we kept this a great secret. And this secret was faithfully kept by both of us. None of my relatives know it, except Anne, and if I did not feel the deepest dependence on your secrecy, I would not have mentioned it to you. And I do not think that Mr. Ferrars can be displeased when he knows that I have trusted you, because I know that he thinks very highly of you and your family. He regards you and your sisters quite like his sisters." She paused. For a few minutes Elinor remained silent. Despite her great astonishment and disappointment, she calmly asked whether their engagement was long-standing. "We have been engaged for 4 years." 4 years! Elinor was still unable to believe it. "Until this moment I did not even know that you were acquainted." "He was under my uncle's care before many years. Did you ever hear of him, the name Mr. Pratt? He was 4 years with my uncle, who lives in Longstaple, near Plymouth. As my sister and I often stayed there, our engagement was formed there. I was too young and loved him so much that I accepted this without knowledge of his mother. Although you do not know Mr. Ferrars so well as me, you may know Miss Dashwood, that he is quite sensible and very capable of making a woman sincerely attached to him." "Engaged to Mr. Ferrars, I confess I am very surprised, but sorry you made a mistake." "We mean the same man," replied Lucy with a shrewd smile. "I am talking about Mr. Edward Ferrars, the eldest son of Mrs. Ferrars, and brother of your sister-in-law. To be sure, I cannot forget the name of the man to whom my whole happiness depends." "It is strange that I have never heard him mention your name," said Elinor, in painful perplexity. "Because it was a secret, I told you. Moreover, he was especially afraid of her sister to suspect anything. 4 years we have been engaged, but only God knows how long we should wait. Poor Edward!" she cried while taking a small picture from her pocket. "I have had this picture for 3 years. I was not able to give him mine, which made him very sad. I am sure that you are the one on the world to keep our secret, because you know its importance for us. His mother should never hear of this, otherwise we shall have no fortune." "Your secret is very safe with me," said Elinor, looking earnestly at Lucy's face, hoping to find something problematic in her eyes. But her face did not suffer any kind of change. After wiping her eyes without being able to make Elinor believe, Lucy went on. "Sometimes I think whether we should break off the matter entirely. What would you recommend me to do, Miss Dashwood? What would you do yourself?" "Pardon me," replied Elinor, startled by the question, "but I cannot give you any advice under such circumstances. Your own judgment must direct you." "Of course, Edward is very much mournful. Didn't you see how dreadful he was when he was at Barton? He was so miserable when he left us at Longstaple to go to you, that I was afraid you would think him rude." "Did he come from your uncle's when he visited us?" "Oh, yes. He had been staying a fortnight with us. Did you think he directly came from the town?" "No, in fact I remember. He told us that he stayed at some friends in Plymouth," replied Elinor. "Was not he in low spirits? Poor fellow! He must be sad at the moment either, because he writes wretchedly. Here is his letter. You must know his handwriting," said Lucy, showing the letter. Elinor saw that the handwriting was really Edward's, so she could doubt no longer. Her heart sank with her. She could hardly stand up, yet she struggled not to show this to Lucy. "Writing is the only comfort we have in such a long separation. I have a picture of him, but poor Edward has only one thing to remind me of. I gave him a lock of hair and a ring, and he said that it was a great comfort for him. Perhaps you have noticed the ring when you saw Edward." "I saw," said Elinor, with a voice full of distress and emotion. She was totally shocked and upset. Fortunately, as they now reached the cottage, Miss Steele left her, and Elinor had enough time to think and worry alone. Chapter 10. Elinor does not give up. At the cottage, Elinor considered all the matter from different aspects. Although she did not fully trust Lucy's words, it was evident from the letter, the ring, and the picture that the present case was true. But had Edward been intentionally deceiving her? Was his engagement with Lucy an engagement of the heart? No, despite all the facts and evidence, she could not believe such a thing. Edward's attention was all her own. It was evident that Edward indeed had an inclination to herself. Her mother, her sisters, and Fanny were all aware of his regard at Norland. It was not an imagination of her own. Edward certainly loved her. If the case was desperate for Elinor, Edward's state of mind should be hopeless. She pitied him rather than blaming him for deceiving herself. The youthful mind at the age of 19 would naturally blind him. When added to the beauty and good nature of Lucy, he must have acted in an insensible way. During the next 4 years, maturity must have opened Edward's eyes. What should he look forward to do now? Can he really be happy with Lucy Steele? Can his integrity, delicacy, and knowledgeable mind be satisfied with illiterate and selfish character of Lucy? All of these considerations gave Elinor great pain, but she wept for Edward rather than herself. He had done nothing to hurt her, and even now, after the first shock, Elinor was resolved to keep her ideas to herself. She had to conceal the matter from her mother and Marianne for a time, for their conversation could have no assistance. She was stronger alone. After her conversation with Lucy, she wished to hear more particulars about their engagement, so she could learn what Lucy really felt for Edward. But indeed, as Elinor was well assured that she was beloved by Edward, she did not fear Lucy's cunning behaviors. And since nothing can hurt her than what she had heard from Lucy, she trusted her own ability to overcome difficulties. So the next day when they met at Middleton's, she engaged Lucy in conversation. "You have honored me with your confidence yesterday, Miss Steele, so I will not apologize for bringing the matter forward again. But I see that yours is an unfortunate case when taking Mrs. Ferrars into account. Edward has only £2,000 of his own, so we are totally dependent on his mother. I personally have been used to a very small income, and I can struggle with any poverty for him. We must wait until his mother is pleased with our marriage. By our very long absence since we were first engaged, Edward's love for me has been put into test, and I have no doubt that he will also overcome these problems for me." Elinor hardly knew whether to laugh or smile at this idea. "But what are your plans? Will you wait for the death of Mrs. Ferrars, which would certainly be a shock and melancholy for Edward, or will you wait until she approves of your marriage? Oh, I know she is a proud woman. In her anger upon hearing our secret engagement, she will probably secure everything on Robert, so I do not want to take hasty measures. We have to wait." "Do you know Robert Ferrars?" asked Elinor. "No, not at all. I never saw him, but I am sure that he is entirely different from Edward, a great coxcomb." They were silent for many minutes, then Lucy began first. "I believe maybe it is the wisest way to dissolve the engagement. With difficulties on every side, we are miserable. Perhaps we would be happier in the end. Will you not give me your advice, Miss Dashwood?" "No," answered Elinor. "You know that my opinion cannot change anything. Deciding your future is not in my power, as I am an indifferent person in this case," replied Elinor cautiously. "Will you be in town this winter, Miss Dashwood?" asked Lucy with all her fake warmth. And upon hearing that Elinor would not be in town, her eyes brightened with joy. "Oh, how sad! I very much wanted to meet you in town. Indeed, I only go for the sake of seeing Edward." Here their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Jennings, and from this time Elinor did not revive the subject. The visit of Miss Steele's at Barton Park was lengthened, and they were pressed to stay there for nearly 2 months in Barton by Sir John. Chapter 11. Journey to London. Although Mrs. Jennings generally spent a large time of the year in Barton, she was now making plans to turn back to her own house in London, and she unexpectedly asked Miss Dashwood to accompany her. At first, the sisters both kindly refused the invitation, saying that they did not want to leave their mother alone at this time of the year. But it was not easy to convince Mrs. Jennings. She insisted on their coming with her together. "I sincerely thank you, madame," said Marianne warmly. "Your invitation gave me the greatest happiness." Elinor understood that her sister was eager to see Willoughby again, and she would not lose any chance of meeting him in London. On being informed by the invitation, Mrs. Dashwood convinced that such a long journey was a very good chance for them. Finally, it was settled that the invitation should be accepted, which made Mrs. Jennings very glad. They departed in the first week of January, and the Middletons were expected to follow them a week later. When they reached town, Marianne's happiness grew. The young ladies immediately settled in an apartment, and before dinner was ready, Elinor sat down for writing a letter to her mother. Marianne did the same, but she said that she was not going to write her mother. Elinor asked no more. She understood that Marianne should then be writing to Willoughby. She quickly finished writing and sent the mail with the footman. She was in high spirits, she could not eat much at dinner, and it was clear that she was anxiously listening to the sound of every carriage. Surprisingly, there was a rap at the door, and waiting for Willoughby's announcement, Marianne hastened to the door, crying, "Oh, Elinor, it is Willoughby indeed!" But she quickly quit the room when Colonel Brandon appeared. "Is your sister ill?" asked he, noticing the situation. "Yes," answered Elinor in distress, and welcomed Colonel, who kindly said that he was very glad to see them in London. Elinor wanted to ask if he ever happened to see Willoughby in town, but afraid of giving Colonel pain, she did not. When Mrs. Jennings came in with her usual noisy cheerfulness, she warmly welcomed Colonel Brandon, and asked if he was happy to see Miss Marianne here. He replied all vulgar questions with mildness, and left them after tea. The next morning Mrs. Palmer came laughing in the room, so delighted to see them again, and after an hour she proposed to visit some shops. At first Marianne was about to decline the offer, because she wanted to wait Willoughby at home, but Elinor persuaded her to go. Marianne was curiously watching around, wishing to see Willoughby. Her eyes were in constant inquiry. When they turned back in the evening, she immediately asked if a letter was left for her, and upon learning that there was not, she sadly wondered why he did not write back. Elinor found it strange too. Why did Willoughby neither come nor write? About a week after their arrival, they learned that Willoughby was also here. When they came from morning's walk, his card was on the table. "Good God!" cried Marianne. "He has been here while we were out." Elinor was also happy to hear that he was in London. "He will call again tomorrow, believe me," she said. But Willoughby paid no second visit. Then they went to Middleton's, who, as soon as reaching London, invited them, and other 20 people to house. They met them in the Palmers, who received them in great friendliness. Marianne glanced round the apartment as she entered. He was not there, so she idly sat down, unwilling to dance or chat with anyone. At the end of the night, when she complained that she was tired, Mrs. Jennings interfered. "Yes, yes, we know the reason. If a certain young man has been there, you would never feel tired of dancing with him. Indeed, it was unkind of him not to come to meeting when he was invited." "Invited?" cried Marianne. "My daughter told me so, because Sir John happened to see him in the street this morning." It was enough to hurt Marianne, and the next morning Elinor saw her writing hastily to Willoughby. During the whole day, after Mrs. Jennings went out herself on business, Marianne was again restless, running from one window to another. She was certainly waiting to hear from Willoughby. When Colonel Brandon was announced, she left the room before he entered. Finding Elinor alone, Colonel looked more than grave, and said that he had something to say about Marianne. "Your sister's engagement to Mr. Willoughby is generally known," he said. "It cannot be so," said Elinor, "because her own family do not know it." Colonel was surprised and apologized for abruptly opening the conversation. When Elinor asked him where he had heard this, he said that Middletons and Palmers always talked about it. "To your sister I wish happiness, and to Willoughby I wish he really deserves your sister." He stood up and went away. Chapter 12. Marianne meets Willoughby at last. During the next 3 days, Willoughby neither came nor wrote. They were getting prepared to attend a party. Marianne, careless of her appearance, did not show any expression of pleasure. When they reached the destination, their names were announced, and when the two sisters seated themselves, Elinor saw Willoughby. He was happily chatting with a fashionable-looking young lady. On seeing Elinor, he slightly bowed, but did not attempt to talk to her. At that moment, Marianne perceived him, and her face glowing with delight, she hastened to move towards him, but Elinor held her hand. "Oh, my God, he's here, Elinor! Oh, but why does he not look at me?" At last Willoughby turned and regarded them both. Marianne affectionately called his name, holding out her hand for him. He approached, addressing Elinor rather than Marianne, and cautiously avoiding to look to her eyes. He asked about Mrs. Dashwood. Elinor was unable to answer, but Marianne exclaimed in great emotion, "Willoughby, what is the meaning of it? Didn't you receive my notes? Will you not shake hands with me?" He held her hand only for a moment, and trying to seem calm, answered that he had called there, but could not find them at home. Then, looking at the young lady with whom he was previously chatting, he looked embarrassed, and quickly bowing, joined his friends. Marianne was unable to stand, sunk in her chair with a dreadfully white face. She begged her sister to take her home, as she was miserable to stay here any longer. Lady Middleton, on learning that Marianne was not feeling well, arranged a carriage. Marianne was silent when they reached home. She directly went to her room, leaving Elinor alone. The next day Elinor woke up very early in the morning, only to find Marianne writing as fast as possible, desperately crying. She must have been writing to Willoughby, maybe for the last time, thought Elinor. "Marianne, may I ask—" "No, Elinor, do not ask me anything. You will soon learn." It was evident that Elinor should not try to soothe her, and she had better leave her sister alone under these circumstances. She dressed and silently left the room. At breakfast she did not eat much, and when a letter was delivered to her, she quickly ran out of the room. Judging from Marianne's manners, it was evident that the letter was from Willoughby, and it did not escape from Mrs. Jennings' notice. "I never saw a young woman so desperately in love in my life. Miss Marianne is a very different creature. I hope he won't keep her waiting long. Where are they to be married?" "Indeed, do you think that my sister is engaged to Willoughby, madame? I assure you that their marriage would be quite a surprise," said Elinor, trying to smile. "How can you say so, Miss Dashwood? Do we not all know the match? They are entirely in love with each other." She laughed heartily. Then Elinor left her in order to have a look at Marianne. She stretched on the bed with the letter in her hand. Elinor took her hand and affectionately kissed her sister, on which Marianne burst in tears and cried desperately. She put all the letters on Elinor's hand, then covered her face with her shaking hands. Elinor first read Marianne's 2 short notes, informing him of their arrival in London, which kindly invited Willoughby to visit her in Mrs. Jennings' house. Then she read Marianne's reproaching letter following the dance, when Mr. Willoughby unexpectedly tried to ignore them. "What am I to imagine, Willoughby, by your behavior last night? I demand an explanation of it. I was hoping to meet you with pleasure, as in the old days when we were in Barton. I was shocked indeed. Your behavior toward me was insulting. I am ready to hear your justification of it. Tell me what it is, and explain the reasons of your action. My feelings are now in a terrible indecision. If your feelings are no longer the same, you will return my letters, and the lock of my hair, which is in your possession. M.D." Willoughby's answer to this letter was as following: "Dear Madame, I have just had the honor of receiving your letter. I am very sorry to learn that you found my behavior last night inexcusable. I am very sorry to indeliberately offend you. I shall never forget our acquaintance with your family in Devonshire, which was the most grateful pleasure. My respect for your family is very sincere, but if I have been unfortunate to express my regard to you more than I felt, I will be very sorry. You will allow me to say that my affections were engaged somewhere else, and in a few weeks I will engage with this lady. I regretfully return your letters and the lock of hair, which you insisted on giving me. J.W." What could be the meaning of this? These words confirmed their separation forever, but Elinor never supposed Willoughby to end their relationship in such an indelicate and direct way. She read the letter again and again, but did not dare to speak in order not to further offend Marianne, who was already wretched and desperate. "Poor Elinor, how unhappy I made you," said Marianne, in sense of sisterly kindness. "I only wish I could do anything to comfort you, my dear Marianne," replied Elinor. Leave me, Elinor. If I give you distress, hate me. Forget me, but do not torture me by saying that I should not exert myself. It is easy for you to say that. You are happy, Elinor. You cannot have any idea of my misery. Do you call me happy, Marianne? Ah, you do not know. Forgive me, she said, throwing her arms around her sister's neck. You must be happy, Elinor. Edward loves you. Yours will be a great happiness, and you will see me miserable always. Have you no other comforts, Marianne? No friends, no family? Think what would happen if you learned Willoughby's character later. What if your engagement was delayed in a later period? Engagement? Cried Marianne. There has been no engagement. No engagement? But he told you that he loved you. Yes, no, never absolutely. He only implied at every opportunity, and sometimes I thought that he loved me, but he never. I felt myself as if I was engaged with him, but he felt the same for me, Elinor. I know he did. I was once very dear to him, and now I cannot understand why he has so changed. Can his indelicate words be justified, Elinor? No, impossible, my dear. And he will be engaged soon. Who is she? Who can she be? I never heard him mention any pretty young lady apart from me." She paused. She was very agitated. "I must go home, Elinor. I cannot bear questions and remarks of people here." Mrs. Jennings came directly to their room to inquire about Marianne when she returned from the party. "Poor thing, she looks very bad, no wonder. Yes, it is true he is to be married very soon. A friend of me told that her fiancé's name is Miss Grey. If I ever met him again, I will scold him. But he is not the only man, Miss Dashwood. With your pretty face, you will have many more admirers. Well, poor girl, I had better leave you alone." Later, Elinor learned from Mrs. Jennings that Willoughby's fiancée, Miss Grey, was very rich, who had £50,000 a year. And she said that the richer but less beautiful girl is luckier than many pretty girls who do not have such a fortune. "But it will be better for Colonel Brandon," she said. "They will be married by midsummer, my dear. I will spirit Colonel as much as I can." Chapter 13. The Secret Past of Willoughby. The next morning, after breakfast, Mrs. Jennings brought a letter from Mrs. Dashwood and went out, leaving Marianne and Elinor alone. The letter had brought Marianne some comfort, but her desire to go home now returned. And Elinor, unable to decide whether it would be better for Marianne to stay in London or in Barton, planned to wait until her mother's wishes. While they were discussing this matter, Colonel Brandon came in, and Marianne again went to her room before his entry. "I met Mrs. Jennings in the street," he said, after the salutation, "and she encouraged me to come here, because I was wishing to find you alone, Miss Elinor," he said hesitantly. "My sole object is to give you some comfort, but not for now, a lasting conviction in your sister's mind. Will you allow me to prove my good will by giving you some information?" "I understand," said Elinor. "You have something to tell me of Mr. Willoughby, I guess. Please let me hear, Colonel Brandon." "You have probably forgotten a conversation in Barton Park, when I said that I once had known a young lady who resembled Miss Marianne," he started. "No, I don't remember. Please go on." "This lady was one of my nearest relations, an orphan who was under the guardianship of my father. Our ages were nearly the same, and I always loved her. She loved me, much too, but at 17 I lost her forever. She was, against her wishes, married to my brother, who did not deserve her. As she experienced unkind treatment, she decided to run away. I took her to Scotland, but a relation of us betrayed us. Until my father's idea was taken, Eliza was given no liberty. Consequently, such a lovely spirit as our sister's faded away. After these unlucky years, I left England, and as my father was not present near her, she had no one to counsel. She ran away again. When I turned to England after 3 years, I searched for her for months. At last, after 6 months, I found her, my unfortunate sister, so altered, so faded. She had much debt, and she was worn down by harsh suffering. I placed her in a proper house with attendances, and visited her during the rest of her short life. In her last minutes, I was with her." Here Colonel Brandon stopped to recover from pity and went on. "She left her little child to my care, a little girl not from her husband. The child was precious to me, and I was ready to be responsible of her education and well-being. But I had no family, therefore I placed her at school. After the death of my brother, I was given the possession of my family, and she visited me at Deptford. 3 years ago I removed her from school and placed under the care of a very respectable woman. She was then 14 years old. But last February she suddenly disappeared. For 8 long months you cannot imagine what I suffered." "Good heavens!" Elinor cried. "Could it be Willoughby?" "The first news from her reached me when I was at Barton planning to take you and Middletons to Whitwell. Do you remember my leaving Barton very suddenly? It must have appeared very strange to everybody. If Mr. Willoughby imagined that the letter was about him, I wonder if he could still look at me with disapproval. Would he be less happy when he was smiling to your sister? He was the man who seduced my little Eliza. Then he had left her promising to return, but neither returned nor wrote. When Eliza reluctantly confessed the name of his lover, we met with him here. And as for Eliza, as soon as she was recovered from illness, I placed her and her child in the country, and now she remains there. When thinking of the unfortunate resemblance between the fates of mother and child, I am terribly worried." Elinor was alarmed. How could Colonel Brandon bear seeing Willoughby so close to Marianne every day? It must have been very painful for him to see them together, when added to his love for Marianne. Knowing all this, guess what I suffered on seeing your sister as fond of him as ever. But what could I do? I did not want to interfere their relation until I heard that he was marrying someone else. Please convey what I told you to your sister, Miss ELINOR. This might lessen her pains, I hope. She was luckier than Eliza. She must be relieved. He then left in order to leave ELINOR alone with Marianne. When she conveyed this conversation to Marianne, ELINOR saw that the effect on Marianne was just like what she had hoped to see. She listened to all the particulars silently, and her tears showed that she felt it impossible. After this conversation, Marianne never quit the room when Colonel Brandon came. She even tried to speak to him with a kind of respect and compassion. She was recovering from Willoughby's shock day by day, but some time was needed for her to gain her natural happiness. Their mother decided that they had better stay in London, because at Barton every place could remind Marianne of Willoughby. By the way, their brother and sister-in-law were to be in London, and it would be right to see their brother there. Early in February, ELINOR informed her sister that Willoughby was married, and left the town just after the marriage. Marianne listened to the news in silence and hid her tears first, but after a short time she could not help crying for Willoughby for the last time. Chapter 14. Miss Steeles arrives at London. About this time the two Miss Steeles arrived at their cousin's house in London, and visited them in Mrs. Jennings's house. ELINOR was sorry to see them, as Lucy's presence always gave pain to her. And Lucy, as she always did, said that she was very happy to find her in London, and asked if they would stay with their brother. She was still wishing to prevent Edward and ELINOR's possible meeting. One morning, despite being reluctant, Marianne and ELINOR agreed to go out with Mrs. Jennings. In one of the shops they saw a young man whose face was as if already known to ELINOR. He, after buying his orders, slightly bowed to ELINOR and walked off with an air of happiness. After the departure of this strange man, ELINOR happened to see her brother in the same shop. ELINOR then learned that they have been in town for 2 days. "I wished to call upon you yesterday," he said, "but we spent the whole day with Mrs. Ferrars. Tomorrow I think I will have time to be introduced to your kind friend Mrs. Jennings, and to see the Middletons, of course. I see that they are excellent neighbors to you in the country. Edward said that you had a wonderful place in Barton." After this short conversation, Mr. Dashwood had to leave the shop. He paid his visit the next day, and met with Mrs. Jennings and Colonel Brandon. After staying there for half an hour, he asked ELINOR to walk with him to Middleton's and introduce him to them. During their short walk, Mr. Dashwood said that Mr. Ferrars was to be married. "Is Mr. Edward Ferrars going to be married?" she asked. "It is not certainly settled, but it will take place sooner or later. His mother, Mrs. Ferrars, is an excellent mother. If the match takes place, she will give him 1,000 per year. The lady is Miss Morton, Lord Morton's only daughter." ELINOR was surprised to hear that, and wondered if Lucy Steele had heard this news. Mr. Dashwood did not keep the subject, and she was unable to learn particulars. Luckily, they found Middletons at home, and later all kinds of civilities. They departed with delight. The next day, Mrs. Dashwood invited Mrs. Jennings and Lady Middleton, and they carried their friendship until their departure from London. In fact, the Dashwoods were very much loved by the Middletons. They determined to give them a dinner. Colonel Brandon, Mrs. Jennings, and the Steeles were also invited. They were to meet Mrs. Ferrars, which made ELINOR a little bit uneasy. She wanted to know if Edward was in town, and if he would attend this dinner, but of course she did not have the courage to ask. The expectation of seeing him, indeed, was enough to make her interested in the subject. The important meeting came. Lucy and ELINOR were to be introduced to Mrs. Ferrars. Lucy, who had long wanted to be personally known to the family, was very happy to be invited by Mr. Dashwood. "I shall be the person to whom my all happiness depends upon," she said to ELINOR. Mrs. Ferrars was a little, thin woman with a serious, even sour face. She did not talk much, and watched every instant with disliking looks. ELINOR's curiosity to see Edward's mother was now satisfied. She was thankful that a further connection between the families would not take place. Chapter 15. Secret engagement is known. When they met with Lucy the next day, ELINOR saw that she was very happy to meet the family, and especially Mrs. Ferrars' treatment relieved her greatly. Seeing that there is no way to get rid of Lucy's conversation, Elinor reluctantly tried to answer her with civility, when suddenly Edward came in. It was a very awkward moment. They looked very foolish. Edward even made a move to quit the room. The ladies recovered themselves first. Lucy slightly addressed him and said no more. But Elinor forced herself to welcome him, with a friendly manner. She would not let the presence of Lucy to deter her from saying that she was happy to see him. Her open manners then gave him some self-comfort. Though still embarrassed, he was able to answer. Lucy kept sitting silently and watching them with envy, so Elinor had to keep chatting with Edward. She then left the room hastily in order to call Marianne. After some time walking around the corridors idly, she fetched her sister. Marianne's joy of seeing Edward was great. She sincerely welcomed him. Still there was silence and tension among them, despite Marianne's warm and friendly manners toward Edward. After talking about the city and weather, Edward said that he had to go, and Lucy followed him, leaving the Dashwoods alone. "Why does she come here so often?" asked Marianne angrily. "Can she not understand that we want her to go?" "What? We are all friends," said Elinor. They were old friends with Edward. It's natural that she would like to see him too. She could not help wondering what would Marianne do if she knew that Lucy had been engaged to Edward for 4 years, but she had to keep her promise and keep silent. Within a few days after this meeting, the same people were to meet at a party. As Elinor was watching the performance of violinists, she saw the young man at the shop, who had bowed to her. Seeing that the man was familiarly talking to her brother, she even wondered who he was. After a few minutes, Mr. Dashwood introduced him as Robert Ferrars, brother of Edward. He addressed her in civility, coming closer to her. Why he was different from Edward he explained to her during 1 hour. Lucy was right. He was totally different from Edward, a true coxcomb, who at every opportunity undervalued Edward and his ideas. Elinor did not want to know him better. It was enough for her to detest this proud man. To make things worse, Elinor had to bear Lucy's joy on learning that Mrs. John Dashwood invited her to stay at their house in London. Such an opportunity of being with Edward and his family was, above all, such a great happiness. Hearing that Mrs. Dashwood found Miss Steeles as the most charming girl in the world, and she even gave a needlebook to them as a gift, further surprised Elinor. After 3 or 4 days, Mrs. Jennings one morning came home from her daughter Mrs. Palmer with shocking news. "Lord, Miss Dashwood, have you heard the news?" "No, madame, what is it?" "Mr. Edward Ferrars, it seems, has been engaged to my cousin Lucy for more than 1 year, and no one knew this except her sister. Could you have believed such a thing? How strange! I have never seen them together, or I would be able to find it out. Well, this was kept as a great secret, because they feared Mrs. Ferrars. Your brother and sister never suspected them for a moment until this morning, when Lucy's sister popped it out. So you may think what a blow it created. Your sister immediately fell into hysterics, and your brother, hearing her screams, ran to the scene. He then called Dr. Donovan, and I learnt all of this from the doctor. Then Lucy, not knowing what had happened, came in only to find them in shock. Poor girl, she was scolded harshly. Your sister said that they should leave her house that moment. Elinor, rather than feeling sorry for herself, ran to Marianne, thinking that it would be more convenient for her sister to hear the news from herself. She simply told the matter, but Marianne's reaction was more than she had expected. She listened with horror and cried excessively. Edward was now a second Willoughby to her, and as for Lucy Steele, she was such an insensible girl who never deserved Edward. "How long have you known this Elinor?" she asked. "I have learnt it when Lucy first came to Barton, before 4 months." 4 months? Have you known this for 4 months? What? While attending me all in my misery, was your heart filled with this sorrow? So calm, so cheerful! How could you stand it, Elinor? I had to keep my promise to Lucy. Besides, I did not want to make you and Mamma sad. I tried not to deceive you and any others, but it was not in my power. But you loved him. During this 4 months, too, you loved Edward. Yes, but now I can think of him with little emotion. I no longer materially suffer myself, so do not be sorry for me, dear Marianne. I wish him happiness. Edward will marry Lucy, who does not in any aspect deserve him. For 4 months I always thought this, without being able to share my misery with anyone. I have heard hopes and future plans of Lucy again and again. Something was clear then. I knew that I separated from Edward forever. Therefore I am not as shocked as you are now, Marianne. "Oh, Elinor," Mary cried, "how barbarous have I been to you! You always shared my suffering, and now I could do nothing to soothe you. Is this my gratitude?" The next day, Mr. Dashwood brought fresh news to them above the dreadful event. "You have heard, I suppose," he began. "Your sister has suffered dreadfully. Mrs. Ferrars, too. Poor Fanny! She was quite sick yesterday, but do not be alarmed. She recovered now. She thinks she was deceived. She had asked these young women to come to her house only because she thought they were well behaved, pretty girls. Was it to be supposed that they were secretly engaged? Therefore we consulted what to do, and Edward was called. When he came, Mrs. Ferrars told him to put an end to the engagement. What do you expect? I have never seen Edward so stubborn. His mother told me that if he marries Miss Morton, he would have so many estate and a very large fortune. She said that she would do anything to prevent his marriage with Lucy, but all was in vain. Edward was very determined, and said that nothing could make him give up the engagement." Elinor's heart sank. Edward ignored her mother's respect, for a woman who could not deserve this. Her brother then said that Edward was totally dismissed from his mother's notice. He left the house yesterday, and nobody knew if he was in town. To make things worse, Mrs. Ferrars decided to settle the estate upon Robert immediately. Poor Edward! What did he want to do by insisting on carrying his engagement? For a day or two nothing was heard of them. At the week-end, Mrs. Jennings and Elinor, taking the opportunity of pleasant weather, went out for a walk. As it was heard that Willoughbys were again in town, Marianne chose to stay at home. Soon after their entrance to the gardens, Elinor met Lucy's sister Nancy, who at first seemed shy. But then, receiving encouragement from the kindness of Mrs. Jennings, she joined their party. After learning that Mrs. Jennings was not angry with her for unraveling Lucy's secret, she quickly gave the latest news about her sister and Edward. "People say that Mr. Ferrars said that he would not have Lucy, but it is not the case. I can tell you, Miss Dashwood, it is such an ill-natured idea." "I never heard anything of that kind until now," replied Elinor. "Oh, indeed? But people say that, I know. Edward did not come to us for 3 days, and Lucy gave up all her hopes, for we did not see him since long. We even did not know where he was. But we then heard that he declared his love for Lucy before her mother and your sister, Mrs. Dashwood. As soon as he left his mother's house, we think he went somewhere else to think the matter thoroughly again. When he returned after 3 days, he said, as he has no fortune at all, that it would be better if they put an end to their engagement. But Lucy directly told him that she would be very glad to live with him, and she could live with a trifling income for Edward's sake. Then he was absolutely happy, and they talked on the day of marriage. He said that they should wait until he gets a living. Edward plans to go to Oxford soon. After some business he will be ordained. Oh, here are the Richardsons. I have to go, Miss Dashwood." So she walked away, leaving Elinor totally awkward and deeply in thought. Edward's marriage with Lucy was firmly determined, except for the time, which faded all her hopes of winning him again. Miss Dashwoods had been staying in London for nearly more than 2 months, and Marianne's impatience for going home was increasing day by day. Elinor, too, was busy with making plans of return, and when she expressed their plan of departure to Mrs. Jennings, she sincerely wanted to keep them in her house for a couple of weeks. But her kind offer was not accepted. The Palmers were also planning to return to Cleveland, but with Mrs. Jennings and Miss Dashwoods. As Cleveland was much nearer to Barton, it would be safer to go with them, but it would keep Marianne away from home for a time. On the other hand, therefore she rejected the idea. Moreover, Cleveland was very near to Somersetshire, Willoughby's house. "I cannot go there," she said violently. "Do not expect me to go there, Elinor." But thinking that Bristol was only a few miles away from Cleveland, and the journey to Barton would take only a day from there, it would be suitable for them to go home using that way. So the kind invitation of Palmers was accepted, and preparations for the journey began. Meanwhile, Colonel Brandon said that he wanted to talk to Elinor on a serious matter, and to Elinor's surprise, he offered a very generous help for Edward and Lucy. "I have heard that your friend Mr. Edward Ferrars had some problems with his family due to his secret engagement," he began. "Attempting to divide 2 young people who love each other is a terrible thing. I heard that he wanted to take orders for being a clergyman. Will you kindly tell him, Miss Elinor, that my house in Delaford is now available? If they accept my humble offer, they can have the house, but it is a very small, old house, which may need some repairment. Elinor was totally astonished at the generosity of Colonel Brandon, and the chance of Edward and Lucy surprised her. Only 2 days ago Edward was hopeless for the marriage, but now all of the people in the world, Elinor herself, was to refresh their hopes. She thanked him with all his heart, and promised to write Mr. Ferrars to inform him about the author. How would she write to Edward? How should she begin? While she was urging herself to write something, Edward came in. Her astonishment was very great on seeing Edward in front of herself, when trying to write him. Edward was very distressed, too, and sat with an embarrassed expression in his face. "I saw Mrs. Jennings at the door, and she said that you were to write me a note," he said. "I would be very sorry to leave London without seeing you and your sister, and in a short time I am going to Oxford." "You would not go without receiving our good wishes, however," Elinor replied. "Mrs. Jennings was right. I want to inform you of an offer from Colonel Brandon. He was here 10 minutes ago, and requested from me to say that he has great pleasure in offering you his house in Delaford, which is at the moment vacant." "Colonel Brandon?" cried Edward. "Can it be possible?" He was naturally astonished, because he was not personally very much known to him. "I believe you will find him a very respectable man, when you know him better, and you will be such near neighbors to him," said Elinor, trying to be calm. Edward did not answer. He just looked at Elinor seriously and earnestly. After asking Colonel's address, he hastened to thank him in his place, and left Elinor alone. She did not attempt to stop Edward. Very sincerely extending her best wishes of happiness, she accompanied him to the door. After the first shock of Edward's secret engagement, Elinor thought that it was necessary to visit her sister-in-law, and set out by herself to their house. Mr. John Dashwood met her in the entrance, and Mrs. John Dashwood did not appear for some time. Mrs. John Dashwood and Elinor talked about Edward and Lucy. To her surprise, Elinor learnt that Robert Ferrars was to marry Miss Morton. "There can be no difference," said Mr. John Dashwood. "Both Edward and Robert are very agreeable young men, so it does not matter which of them marries Miss Morton." Meanwhile, Robert Ferrars came in, and Mr. John Dashwood left him with Elinor, to inform her wife of their being here. After just 2 minutes, he began to talk about Edward. As he has heard the recent news about his being ordained, he laughed heartily. "Poor Edward, he is ruined forever. I am very sorry for him, because I know that he is such a good-hearted man. When I first saw his lady, I was startled indeed. An awkward country girl, without style or elegance, and almost lacked beauty. She is just a kind of a girl who could possibly captivate poor Edward." Chapter 16. Farewell to London. Very early in the morning, in a beautiful April day, the party in Mrs. Jennings' house and the Palmers set out for Cleveland. Mr. Palmer and Colonel Brandon would join them in Cleveland soon after their arrival. The journey was safely performed, and on the 3rd day they reached Cleveland. Colonel Brandon and Mr. Palmer reached the next day, so the party was completed. Although it had rained hard when they first came, the weather was tolerably fine, which gave Marianne the opportunity of taking walks in green pastures and shrubs. However, delightful walks on the 3rd and 4th day of her arrival, Marianne caught such a violent cold that her mother had to come to soothe her as soon as possible. After feverish and restless nights, she tried to prove that she was better, but in fact the illness was really violent. Prescriptions of Mrs. Palmer's doctor, too, were unable to make her better. Seeing that Elinor was desperately toiling to make her sister better, Colonel Brandon offered to go to Barton to take Mrs. Dashwood there. His offer was readily accepted. Not a moment was lost. The horses arrived, and Colonel Brandon set out alone. Elinor quickly went to Marianne and gave her the good news that her mother would be there the next day. The next day, Elinor expected Colonel Brandon and her mother at 10 o'clock at night. The night was cold and stormy. The wind blew round the house, and the raindrops beat against the windows. Elinor was restless. At 8 o'clock she heard a carriage driving up to the house. Were they coming 2 hours earlier? Hearing them opening the door, she hastened to meet them at the door, entered the drawing-room, and she saw Willoughby. With a look of horror, Elinor attempted to turn back, but Willoughby insisted on her listening to him for a few minutes. He quickly expressed that he had heard from Sir Middleton that Marianne was very ill, and on this occasion also wanted to apologize for his inconvenient manners. He was drunk and looked very miserable. "If I could be able to offer my apology, I am not sure you would hate me less than you do now, "But, Miss Eleanor, I have not always been a rascal," he said. "Let me say that the happiest minutes of my life was spent with your sister." He went on, but Eleanor interrupted. "You should not speak this way, Mr. Willoughby, for you are a married man. You have made your choice. Nobody forced you to marry Mrs. Willoughby." "No, do not tell me about my wife. I never liked her, she knew. Let me tell you why I had to leave dear Marianne in a cruel way. I never had a large fortune, but I was always spending too much. When Mrs. Smith set me free, I made plans of marrying a rich woman and found Miss Grey. When I heard that you were in London too, and after Marianne sent me those notes, I deliberately did not come to see you. I had no right to hurt her feelings further, I knew. I was engaged, everything was settled for me. Do you remember my letters? How cruel they were! But they were not my words, please believe me. My fiancée, seeing that I received a letter, forced me to read it, and she felt jealous. Those were her words, in fact. I know, your sister is lost to me forever, but will you repeat her what I told you all? Tell her that my heart is filled with sorrow, and she is dearer to me than ever." He then quickly got out of the room, leaving Eleanor totally surprised. In spite of all his faults, Eleanor felt sorry for him. She then went to her sister, who was unconscious with fever. Within half an hour after Willoughby's departure, she heard the sound of a carriage, and went hastily to meet her mother. Mrs. Dashwood was in terror, as if they had lost Marianne. Shedding tears, she embraced Eleanor again and again. Still unable to speak, she ran to Marianne's room. Eleanor's joy of seeing them together was undefinable. After their mother's arrival, Marianne continued to get better day by day. Her cheerfulness and natural happiness again filled the house with joy. How happy her mother, Eleanor, and Colonel Brandon were to see her better. Now that her beloved child was better, Mrs. Dashwood shared her future plans for Marianne and Colonel Brandon with Eleanor. She said she was, from the very beginning, planning to match Colonel Brandon with her, rather than Willoughby. "He told me everything yesterday as we traveled. As you may believe, I could talk nothing but my child. He was equally concerned for Marianne. Then he openly revealed his earnest, tender, and constant affection for Marianne. He loved her, my Eleanor, from the moment he first saw her, so I will do anything to promote their marriage. Your sister deserves such an honest man as Colonel Brandon." Eleanor was happy to see that her mother supported Colonel Brandon, rather than Willoughby. As Marianne was strong enough for a journey, the Dashwoods made preparations for turning back to Barton. When the departure date arrived, Marianne, bidding Colonel Brandon and Mrs. Jennings friendly farewell, could not avoid feeling ashamed of her past thoughts about Colonel Brandon, who undoubtedly deserved more than that. When they arrived at Barton, Marianne was in a silent mode. She was in a melancholy. Even after they settled their beloved home and took short walks in green pastures, she seemed calm and quiet. Eleanor, watching her sister very closely, asked if she was not happy to be home. Was there something which made her unhappy? "I know I shall be happy, Eleanor," she said. "I know the summer will pass happily away. I will spend all day reading and listening to music. I can borrow new books from Colonel Brandon. I am thankful that I can remember my memories with Willoughby with very little pain. He can't make me worse, Eleanor. When I look past, I see that I made everyone unhappy for the sake of him. My family and my real friends, including Colonel Brandon and Mrs. Jennings, are dearer to me than ever." Eleanor, remembering her promise to Willoughby, thought that it was the most convenient to tell her what Willoughby had said. Trying to be calm, she related their dialogue in a soft voice. Marianne did not say a word. She trembled. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, and when Eleanor affectionately pressed her hand, the tears covered her cheeks. Chapter 17. The Happy Ending. The next day their servant brought some news for the family. He said that Mr. Ferrars was married. Marianne gave a violent scream, fixed her eyes upon Eleanor, who turned pale. They further inquired the man, then he told. "I saw Mr. Ferrars myself, madame, this morning in Exeter, and his lady Miss Steele was there too. I saw Miss Lucy in a carriage, and she called to me to inquire after you, madame. They were in a great hurry. Mr. Ferrars was in the carriage too, but he did not talk to me." Eleanor's heart sank. He was married with Lucy at last. He was gone forever. In spite of all her good intention, she had always hoped something to prevent their marriage. But he was now married. Lucy won. That was all. Now the days of misery and pain would begin, and no consolation would soothe her pain, she knew. While thinking of Edward after dinner at the window, she saw a man on horseback was coming to the cottage. "Colonel Brandon comes," she thought. He would certainly bring news about Edward. But it was not Colonel Brandon, it was indeed Edward himself. She moved away and sat down. Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood were also shocked to see Edward. They changed color, and all waited in silence until Edward came in. He was pale and restless. His manners were, as usual, reserved. Trying to look normal, Elinor talked about the weather as they sat down, and Marianne left the room in order not to show her distress. Then Mrs. Dashwood felt obliged to ask whether Mrs. Ferrars was very well. But Elinor asked with a trembling voice, "Is Mrs. Ferrars very well?" "Yes, my mother is very well, thank you," he replied. "I meant," said Elinor, with an effort to seem calmer, "Mrs. Edward Ferrars." "Perhaps you mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars," replied Edward calmly. "Mrs. Robert Ferrars!" Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood repeated in the same tone of astonishment. Elinor could not speak. Her eyes watched Edward. "Perhaps you do not know. My brother is recently married to Mrs. Lucy Steele." Elinor could not believe what she had heard. She almost ran out of the room as soon as she heard this, and burst into tears of joy. And Edward, seeing her sudden departure, also left the room without saying good-bye to Mrs. Dashwood. It was now certain that Edward was free, and he came to Barton only to ask Elinor to marry him. After he left their house in such an excited manner, he engaged her mother's consent for marrying with Elinor. His heart was then opened to Elinor. All his weakness and errors were confessed. And as for his foolish affection to Lucy, he said that at the time he spent much of his time at Longstaple with Lucy's uncle, and he was too young to consider Lucy's real character. Following these confessions, the Dashwoods had a sleepless night. Mrs. Dashwood did not know how to praise Edward. Marianne could not help crying, but Elinor's feelings were undefinable. From the moment of learning that Edward did not marry Lucy, her heart was filled with hope and joy. Now, having Edward in the cottage at least for a week, she had enough time to talk of the past, present, and the future. How could Robert and Lucy love each other? How could Robert choose to marry a girl whose manner and beauty he despised? Elinor was unable to comprehend. However, it was now time to be happy, rather than think of other people's choices. After a few days, Colonel Brandon was expected at the cottage, and Edward really wished to know him better. So they acquainted and found each other very agreeable. They resembled each other in good sense and manner of thinking. They were in love with two sisters, and two sisters were fond of them. Therefore, their mutual regard was natural. Mrs. Dashwood explained everything to Colonel Brandon about Edward and Elinor, which made the Colonel happier for giving his house at Delaford to them. After Colonel Brandon's visit, the two gentlemen left Barton together. They directly went to Delaford to make necessary improvements in the house. Their wedding ceremony took place in Barton Church early in the autumn. The first month of their marriage was spent in a temporary accommodation. Then after the house in Delaford was completed, they moved to their home. When Mrs. Jennings visited Elinor and her husband, she found them as the happiest couple in the world. Their only wish was to see Marianne and Colonel Brandon also married. Marianne Dashwood had an extraordinary fate. Her experience showed her the falsehood of her opinions. She had the courage to overcome a faulty affection, and now, at the age of 19, she was attached to a man whom she had considered too old to be married 2 years ago. Colonel Brandon was now as happy as he really deserved. Marianne's love for him gave him an unbelievable joy. Eventually, being Mrs. Brandon, Marianne found real affection in Colonel Brandon. Between Barton and Delaford, Mrs. Dashwood built a strong family tie, and with absolute content witnessed the happiness of Elinor Ferrars and Marianne Brandon.